and welcome to the Comic Concierge Podcast, the podcast that believes that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Today, I am very honored to have a very special guest with me today. He is the writer of many fantastic comic book series, including Exit Stage Left's The Snagglepuss Chronicles, The Flintstones, an upcoming Judge Dredd series, including the novels as well as God's Disappointed You and Apocrypha Now. Mark Russell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time. As I indicated, the kind of the thesis of this podcast is that comics are for everyone. And with that, I tend to, when people come on, get an idea of their background of comics in the sense of what their lack of background or what got them into them. So I thought that'd be a good place to start in the sense of, what is that got you into comics as a fan or as a writer?
Yeah, well, as a writer, I'm a pretty much a newcomer to comics. I didn't really start writing comics until 2015. When I started working on a series for DC called Prez about a teenage girl who gets elected president. That was the first comic I'd ever written. And I have to admit, my background in comics as a fan is pretty lacking compared to most comic book creators. Most comic book creators eat, live, and breathe comics. They know, they've been reading comics forever. They know the canon for at least the big two. So I was really kind of not. I was not much of a comic book fan growing up. I didn't read a lot of comic books, and I wasn't nearly as familiar with comic books as most other creators when I started. So I had to do a lot of catching up. And I mean, there are a lot of comic book creators I really love. I'd always read, of course, the big ones like Alan Moore. I read The Watchmen and loved it, and V for Vendetta. And I read a lot of Daniel Clowes, who's still probably my favorite comic book creator. But in terms of like the big two, I hadn't read a lot. And I'm finding, though, that there's a lot. I mean, this is not really a surprise to anyone anymore. There's a lot of really wonderful writing, like capital L literature in comics, even in like the superhero franchises that you normally wouldn't expect to find that sort of cutting or really insightful commentary on the world around him. So I've had a lot of catching up to do as a creator, but at the same time, I've really enjoyed it. Sometimes like when somebody tells me that they haven't seen a movie that I love, I sort of envy them because they now have the chance to watch a movie for the first time that I've loved for years. And so I kind of feel like that's me as a comic book creator. Like I get to discover these things for the first time, which I didn't really grow up on. And I hope that, and I think my appreciation is a lot fresher for these things than maybe somebody who did just grow up consuming them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think even reading your comics, I think there's a fresh voice in there. Obviously, especially with something like the Flintstones or Prez, you obviously have these franchises you're working with that have a history, but there's no, I think, reverential treatment. It's very much you're able to kind of approach them in a new perspective. I think it's really good when creators who are not familiar, super familiar with comics come on board, and you get some really new and fresh voices into the medium.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I don't really know enough to be reverential, and it's probably been an asset. Since I think these are the sort of comics I like too when I read them. They're not the comics that are just written by people who are just sort of commenting on other comics or riffing on other comics that they've read in the past.
Yeah,
I tend to like the ones that are people writing about the real world, things they've experienced or other interests they have outside of comics, and then using comics as a prism to translate them into a story. But to me, that's what's meaningful, using comics as a medium to talk about the outside world, not just comics to sort of regurgitate the formulas we've already seen 100 times before.
Definitely. Is that typically your process when you're kind of constructing your narratives, where you have an idea of the message or the themes that you're going for, and then you try to figure out how to shape the narrative around it? Or do you do more like an inside-out approach? Or within you creating the story, you kind of find out, okay, this is where I want to approach this story, or this is the themes I'm going for? I'm just curious how you approach your overall creative process.
Yeah, I just kind of do whatever works, and sometimes it's either or both of those. Like sometimes there's something very distinct I want to say. There's something I want to say, and so I come up with a sort of parable.
Yeah.
to say that works in comic book form. And then other times I just have a story, and I just, or even not even a story, just a moment. As I start writing it, I start working inside out, and then from there I figure out at the end what the story was actually about.
I know with like God's Disappointed in You and Apocrypha Now, including the Flintstones, you're looking at often where society is beginning. The early stages where we kind of went wrong to start with, and then with Prez, and I'm assuming the upcoming Judge Dredd series, you're looking at where we're going. When you're looking at constructing kind of your parables, as you called them, is that approach any different from looking at two different perspectives in that way?
Yeah, it's a little different in that I have to work within the franchise itself, the strictures of the franchise, but it's the same in that I tend to think of like this as like what are the central problems of this world, or what is it in this world that people would be having to deal with. And in the Flintstones, because they're creating civilization, they're making it up as they go along.
Yeah.
The problems they're going to be encountering are basically those of gullibility, or like or naivete, not understanding the implications of coming up with like television, or live news, or electing leaders because they sound like they kick ass. It's unfortunately a naivete we don't seem to have shed 30,000 years later.
Not so much.
But yeah, it's very different than talking about a civilization that has already made those mistakes several times, and is just sort of dealing with the aftermath of them. I think that the sort of a key point in writing any sort of dystopia is that chances are the people living in the dystopia don't realize they're living in a dystopia. So to them, this is just normal. This is just life. But to the reader at home, they obviously realize how messed up, everyday life is for these people. So I try to remember that when I'm writing a futuristic thing, like to make those characters just sort of like almost blasé to the sorts of things that horrify us that are going on in their world. Whereas the Flintstones, everything was brand new, so I tried to do it the opposite, where like everything kind of strikes them with a sense of wonder and newness.
Interesting. It's like establishing a normalcy, where the other one, as you mentioned, the naivete of everything new and fresh. That's
right. Try to make the horrifying seem mundane, and then and also the mundane seems spectacular.
you wonder, looking at today's world, if that's all too common. If whoever's writing our story might be taking the same approach.
Yeah, right. I think we probably are at one of these points in history where we're some weird confluence of naivete and dystopian resignation, largely because I don't think we've come to terms with the implications of the new information economy and social media, and how we're being used by them, how we have become the product, not the users of these things. And so in that sense, we are like the Flintstones, but at the same time, it feels very much like it's devolving into a dystopia, like Judge Dredd.
Very true. And with that, you mentioned like social media. We are in a world where like social and political commentary is everywhere. Like you can't kind of escape it. And obviously, your books, as you mentioned, they have that leaning, and I think it's very effective. I think it's the way you approach it is sharp, and especially for a comic, I think it shows how well comics can approach like the social commentary of today. For you, what is like the key to effective social commentary? Is it the ability to convey an interesting message, or the ability to be kind of see things from different perspectives? Like, because we see a lot of it, and most of it doesn't tend to be very good. I was just curious, what do you think the differentiating factor is between good social commentary and maybe heavy-handed or missteps?
I think a lot of it boils down to simplicity. Like, how do you take a complicated issue and reduce it down to one line or one point that will hit the reader like a lightning bolt? To me, that's always the challenge of good social commentary, is like how not to make your commentary as convoluted as the topic often is itself.
Do you notice certain topics that it's easier to do that with than others?
Yeah, and I think it's a lot easier to do it the, if the less angry you are about it.
Oh,
I mean, there's lots of things I write about which disturb me and which I feel passionately about, but I try not to write about them while I'm feeling that way, because it clouds my objectivity, and it multiplies the number of things I want to say about it. I try to like look at it. I try to like, even though there are things that deeply disturb me or that I feel very passionately about, I try to like cool off a little and then look at it like I would if I were an anthropologist visiting from outer space. Like if I had to explain in an elevator to my boss on the planet Las Vega what is wrong with the human race, how would I do it? And usually just come up with a line or two.
yeah. I noticed that reading, God's disappointed in you in the sense of where you were boiling down in the entire Bible, and clearly there was jokes being made and things of that nature, but there was a lack of nastiness, as you said. There was more of a matter of factness to it, and it didn't seem like it's almost like when you're talking about a family member, it's like you know them well enough to approach the things most people don't, but you also know there's a line that you don't want to cross, because then you, like you said, you lose your objectivity. Notice that too in like the last issue of the Flintstones, the conversation that they have about religion. I thought that was a really key piece. Did the work you did on those two series, did they often coalesce with one another since they kind of covered some similar topics?
Yeah, and I mean they all kind of are ultimately mouthpieces for my own sort of views on the world and who we are as human beings. But yeah, I that's very much by design. I want to, even if I think something's wacky, I want to at least understand why people feel that way or why they believe in what they do. And so that forces you into this sort of role of attempting to be objective and think, well, how would I see it if I were them? And basically, I guess objectivity is probably the wrong word. What I really am striving for is a state of empathy.
Okay.
Like, help me help me see the world through their eyes. Even if it's something that I really just do not understand or like at all. Help me see the world through the eyes of the people who do, and then I can perhaps make a better point about them, and maybe even also something that is sympathetic to what they're trying to do, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do: understand the world around us, but in a way that at the same time sort of shows its flaws, their what they believe.
Interesting. And you mentioned empathy and sympathy. Does that begin with designing of the characters? Because I feel like, reading like the Flintstones, for example, you were able to make well-rounded characters out of a bowling ball and a vacuum cleaner that I never been that emotionally tied to. Well, I guess not technically an inanimate object, but in their world, yes. Is that usually how you feel like is the most effective way of doing that, by making them complete characters and allowing you to empathize with them in the plight that they're going through?
Well, I think you have to remember that everyone's sort of the hero of their own story.
Yeah.
And that even a minor character, to them, they're not a minor character.
True.
And so I think when you're writing about a world with minor characters, you have to remember that all we know is what we see before us. And the minor characters, they're going to think that the story is about having to live in a closet when you're no longer useful as a vacuum cleaner, or this big guy taking you to the bowling alley and just rolling you down the alley at these pins for reasons he never bothers to explain to you.
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways that also kind of like underscores this sort of feeling of sort of being lost in a universe we did not create, that we all sort of feel. And I think it allows us to empathize with the vacuum cleaner and the bowling ball, because we're all ultimately grasping with the same problem, that the rug has been pulled out from under us for reasons we don't know why.
True. For a character like Judge Dredd that what your series is coming out soon, is that a little bit different? Because he to me seems like a character that, at least in his head, has control, of everything, or attempts to control it. Is that approach for a character like that any different than it would be for someone that has a different perspective?
Well, you're right in the sense that he's not dealing with a lot of existential uneasiness.
Yeah.
He's a man who thinks he understands the world and knows what to do in every situation. So he's definitely a different character to write. But I think ultimately it's the same process, in the sense that I try to see the world through Dredd's eyes. I try to see why the law is basically, he's a fundamentalist, for the law, why the law has become his religion, and why it's so vital to him, and why it's such it's basically all of his entire identity is wrapped into enforcing the law to the extreme letter.
Yeah, I know with Prez and the Flintstones, you went in with not that much ties to the original property. Is it similar with Judge Dredd, where you're kind of going in with open eyes and approaching it, not really a fan first, but just seeing something new that you get to play around with?
No, it's a very different process in the sense that, when I took on the Flintstones, I was given pretty much carte blanche, and I didn't really, watched the Flintstones cartoons when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But I didn't really remember that much about them, and I didn't feel really tied to that at all. But writing Judge Dredd is very different in the sense that you have to be very careful with the franchise. You have to really be within the Mega City 1 Judge Dredd universe when you're writing. You don't get the same freedom. But then again, it's such a rich environment to be working in. And Mega City 1 is like one of the greatest sort of world building enterprises in the history of human literature, as far as I'm concerned, that I didn't mind. I didn't mind having to work with those restrictions, because I just found it such a fascinating place where so much can happen, and especially where so much could go wrong.
You've mentioned previously, when it comes to that, you talked about Mega City 1 and its creation and like the planning that would go into something like that. Is that going to be a key part of your series?
It's not really a commentary on urban planning, but it definitely factors in. It's really a glitch in urban planning that kind of sets the whole premise in motion.
Okay.
In the sense that they'd planned this self-sustaining, affordable city block, the Patrick Swayze block, and it was going to, it was going to have like a factory, and it was going to have like a soy farm, and everyone in the block was going to have a job working there in the block, and it was going to be this sort of like model, like affordable housing, kind of how they had originally planned the slums, the tenement housing, the projects in like New York. They were originally designed, in the 20s and 30s to be this sort of, utopian idea that we're going to have this great housing, and it's going to be modern and affordable, and it's going to be close to all the jobs. But it didn't really pan out that way. The jobs moved away out of the cities. The tax dollars went with it. The jobs, as white flight, people moved out of the cities. So the people who moved into these buildings, these projects, kind of had the rug pulled out from underneath them, because the promises that led them to live there were never really fulfilled. And the citizens of Patrick Swayze kind of undergo the same thing, where the factory was never built, the soy farm never materialized, and so then they're left, their one asset in this building being that has like a waste tunnel that runs from the building to the wall, through the wall of Mega City 1. So they just, to bring in money into Patrick Swayze block, they're forced to like start taking in toxic waste and sewage from like other buildings and other sectors, and they basically just become a dumping ground. And it becomes, it's this story of this model housing unit turning into like a nightmare overnight, and it becomes the site of a mutant invasion because of its neglect.
It sounds pretty fascinating. Regarding that, I know it's kind of a very tonal shift in the sense of question, but it is Patrick Swayze block, so I do have to ask, do you have a favorite Patrick Swayze movie, and why is it Roadhouse?
Roadhouse is I think Roadhouse is what kind of gave me the idea to call it the Patrick Swayze block.
Interesting.
Because he's like this sort of like heroic, like sort of good looking tough guy.
Yeah.
In a way that I think that this is kind of how the Judges in Mega City 1 envisions itself. Like, oh, we're like Patrick Swayze, we're kicking ass, and not even getting our hair messed up in the process. When in fact there's a lot going wrong in Mega City 1, just because they can't be bothered enough to look at the details of what they're doing.
Yeah, that's very true. Was it difficult not making endless amounts of Tango and Cash references, since it's like right there for you? That's got to be challenging.
I ended up not using it, but I did have this one scene where the guy who kind of runs the gang that runs Patrick Swayze is like telling his soldiers in like sort of a pep speech that this building was named after an ancient warrior in the 20th century who was respected and feared everywhere he went. And then they go into battle like yelling like Patrick Swayze. But it felt wrong when I started finishing the script, so I took that scene out.
I could understand that. Still effective, at least it's a good story to tell. At least.
Yeah, nice little extra.
Maybe in the director's cut. I know that's a big thing now. So
it'll be the deleted scenes along with Dom DeLuise popping up dressed like a superhero.
We can only hope. One book we haven't talked about that much is Snagglepuss, which is currently out. Issue 4 just came out recently. Looking at issue 3, you had a really good quote in there regarding the difference between movie stars and movie actors, like how movie stars are who we see ourselves, who we want to be, where movie actors are who we see ourselves as. And it had me thinking do you think in a way that's why superheroes are so popular, because they kind of exist in both worlds where, we see ourselves as Peter Parker, but we want to be Spider-Man, so they kind of fulfill both of those roles?
Yeah, and that's kind of, I was talking, albeit metaphorically, for, kind of what I've experienced in comics.
Yeah.
And that there are comics that are, and this is not to denigrate either kind, but they do play two different roles.
Yeah.
And one is what I try to do, like talk about the world, show you who you are, and this is what is happening. And but I think that the role of superheroes in general in most comics is really more aspirational. Like this is who you wish you were.
Definitely, I thought that was a good point, and it's like you said, it's saying it in the most simple way fashion, but with that, there's a lot of poignancy there.
Yeah, and so it was sort of an indirect commentary on my role in comics and the role of comics and telling people what about who they are, or giving them a vision of what they want to be via this TV show where they're talking about acting.
Yeah. And with Snagglepuss too, was that a similar process where you had more carte blanche to do what you wanted? You're kind of filling in a background that was really never there before.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't really have any restrictions from working with the franchise. In fact, they asked me if I could include more characters, and so that's when I started like creating roles for Augie Doggy and Peter Potamus, all these sort of minor Hanna-Barbera characters to sort of populate the story. But yeah, there were really no restrictions in what I could do with it, because as you say, there was really no backstory for Snagglepuss. There's no continuity to screw up.
Honestly, I knew nothing of Snagglepuss before I was reading the series. I think only thing I knew about it was his catchphrase, and then I was like, "Is this canon?" And does not that it matters. So I was just like, "This is rather fascinating." Was there a reason that you focused in specifically on like the 1950s, like the Red Scare era? Did that seem like just the most fruitful avenue to tell that story?
I focused in on it because I tried to ask myself, like, well, if I'm going to write this Snagglepuss comic, and originally my only concept that I wanted to write about was like him as sort of a closeted gay Southern Gothic playwright. All his catchphrases are theater related, so he obviously has a background in theater, and he's this gay icon. He's clearly like a closeted gay character in the cartoons. So I thought, well, what would that be like if he was an actual person living in the 50s? Obviously he has like some reason, he has some like background in theater. Was he forced to like leave theater because of something? What sort of thing would force you to leave theater or show business in the 1950s? And of course that led me to the Red Scare or the Lavender Scare. So then the story began sort of constructing based upon that central conceit and the time in which he was alive.
Hearing that character, like I never would even connect the dots, but I feel like it does open the door for a lot of, like you said, deconstruct it and figure out where it came from. So
yeah, I mean, Exit Stage Left is obviously a theater reference, and Heavens to Murgatroyd. I had never heard this phrase outside of Snagglepuss, so I looked it up, and it's actually like a Rodgers and Hammerstein reference.
Oh wow!
I thought, this guy really knows the deep cuts. in like theatrical history. So he probably was like a playwright or an actor or something at some point.
Hanna-Barbera was a lot more into theater than I realized, apparently. So.
Yeah.
Speaking of, you talked about with those series that you were given a lot of freedom. Was there anything that you did specifically that you thought, okay, they're gonna say no to this, but I'm gonna try it anyways, but ended up actually pushing through and you were able to do it?
Yeah, pretty much everything I've done where I thought this is going to get kiboshed has gotten through. But a few things I tried to do, which I thought were completely uncontroversial, that they did make me go back and change, which is kind of a strange experience. But basically, they let me do whatever I want to do, with the caveat that it cannot get them sued. So anything they feel is likely to get them sued, they made me go back and change. But otherwise, I had complete freedom. And apparently, there's some estates of some stars who are no longer alive are pretty litigious. So I had to go back and make some creative changes to the characters who were based upon some of the real people.
Interesting. It's interesting that there's higher regulations for writing a comic than running for elected office. It's odd.
Yeah, it's it's strange to me because these are well-known historical figures. It's like, how can you not? How should they be? Why are they entitled to more anonymity than people who aren't well-known historical figures?
Yeah, you would think it'd be in the sense of it'd be more the current people that you're bringing up rather than the historical aspect of it. But I guess
that's kind of what I figure. It's like if someone can sue you for writing a story about somebody who is like a documented historical character or personage, then how does anyone write historical fiction?
That's a good point. I mean, I know that there's been the Martin Luther King estate is very strict when it comes to stuff like that, and so I guess
I think the answer is it's not so much about protecting the legacy of these people as it is trying to see if they can get in on the money, which I don't think there's that much money in this comic, but yeah, it's a shame because it really does sort of restrict creative freedom.
Yeah, I know that's like a topic that often comes up within comics and the idea of copyright, because how that's been changing and how that where the public domain fits in, and like how that's really kind of impacted people's ability to do things like that regarding satirizing or kind of bringing in other properties.
Yeah, and I understand, protecting your work as an artist and not wanting somebody to be able to like use your work, but these are actual people. These are people who existed and lived in the public eye. I don't think they should be given the same sort of protection. And I think it's ultimately sort of chilling on free speech. It's like if you have to be careful what you say about famous living or dead people.
Yeah, it goes back to the point of like writing in the sense of you don't know you're in dystopia. Something like that is a situation where we don't really think about all that much. You mentioned that you came in from the outside in the sense of not a lot of experience. You came with comics, and now you've written a few series now, and you're writing another one. Is there anything that you've learned in the process that you wish you knew when you began that you've now that you've kind of been able to have a few experiences with different mediums?
Yeah, probably the best lesson I've learned in writing comics is to trust your artist with as much creativity as you allow yourself. Uh-huh. So don't overload panels with descriptions of all these things happening in the panel. Just try to give them the essentials and let them come up with like cool background details or placement of characters on their own. Don't, really you need to view it as a writer as first and foremost a visual medium, and secondly as a collaborative process. And I think once you internalize those lessons as a writer, you're a lot better off.
So it's a comic script more akin to that of like a TV script or movie script rather than it is to an actual narrative or novel?
Yeah, it's much closer to like say like a play or like a TV script than it is a novel writing, and that you try to put as much of it in the visual frame as possible and as little in sort of exposition and in narrative.
Are there any other properties out there that you still have a desire to maybe one day write now that you've been able to be in the world of comics that you'd like to be able to tackle?
Oh, yeah. There's lots of them. I would love to write a Swamp Thing series, for
Oh,
instance, because I think there's like all kinds of room for commentary on environmentalism and what's happening to the ecology of the planet, and how far we can push nature before it pushes us back. And that, I just love the character. I think that it's this, in Alan Moore's hands, it was like this sort of gothic horror masterpiece. And I would love the chance to write a character like that.
Yeah, I think that would be fascinating. I know a lot of people have been hoping that we would see another Swamp Thing series, because it does seem like, looking at where we are today, he would be a character that you could utilize with very timely and universal messages, considering his background and where he's been.
Yeah, I would hope DC would see it that way. They did let me write an 8-page Swamp Thing story for the Young Monsters in Love special in February. Came out on Valentine's Day, so I did get to do at least that much.
Nice. So you got a little bit, at least.
Yeah, and I also wrote a couple of 10-page Superman short stories for the upcoming Action Comics specials that are coming out next month. So that was gratifying too, because Superman's another character I've always thought would be really amazing to write, because to me he's like different than the other superheroes in the sense that not only just because he's like so much more powerful, but to me the real superpower is not the powers, but the fact that he has them and yet remains sort of like good.
Yeah.
It's the real superpower is keeping it all together in his head, despite the fact that he's got all these awesome powers.
Wow. So will that be in the Action Comics 1000? What or the different specials that are
No, it's not in the 1000, but they're doing a couple of other Action Comics specials in May. So there's one with and Jill Thompson's done the artwork for it. I forget what, I don't know if it's called anything special. I think it's just Action Comics special number 1. And then apparently there's going to be a number 2 at some point, and there'll be another story in that.
When you went into that character, I'm guessing there was probably a lot more restrictions on you regarding the story you would have to write.
Yeah, well, I mean, I pitched the stories beforehand, so I knew the stories would fly, because they approved them before I even started working on them. And but yeah, there's a lot more editorial feedback on like Superman wouldn't say this. You've got to we need to have him shown this way. So a lot more sort of like caretaking of the franchise, which I completely understand, because it's you're playing with the crown jewels at that point.
Definitely makes sense. Were you surprised with, like, speaking of that, with the Flintstones? I know there are major Flintstones fans out there, but for what I could tell, it seemed like it was universal praise that, considering how fickle or fans can be about things changing, that there wasn't more of a complaint out there that these Flintstones are not my Flintstones or anything of that nature.
Yeah, it's kind of like what happened with the book I wrote about the Bible.
Yeah.
I was expecting death threats and all kinds of opprobrium. But no, the death threats were pretty disappointing. They didn't really materialize. And I think part of it is that the people who normally would be offended by what you're doing to the franchise, when they see it, realize that even though they might not like it, and it might not be what they remember or loved about the franchise, they at least respect the fact, I think, that I'm coming at it from a place of affection. That I'm not trying to like assassinate the Bible or the Flintstones. I'm really just trying to, I really genuinely care about the characters in my own way.
Yeah, I think, and that's certainly the case. I think ultimately too, if it's good, people will be happy. And I think that was the expectation of, like, not going in knowing, okay, what is this? What is this coming up? I know personally I was a fan of Prez, so I saw that was coming up. I'm like, where is this going? But the first issue, I think, was one of the most talked about issues that I could remember, especially when, just the utter surprise of just how good it was. Not to overblow it, but I thought it was just,
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think the number one phrase in my reviews is like, this is actually good. I'm not kidding. Which, is on the one hand is flattering, but on the other hand, it's like, why do they need the equivocate on it? But I understand it's because people have very low expectations a lot of times for a writer they've never heard of, and B, a franchise that maybe they think is supposed to suck.
I think too, there's some apprehension to licensed properties, but I feel like we're seeing what DC really pushed forward a lot of their Hanna-Barbera stuff and Looney Tunes stuff, and have been doing some inventive things with it the last few years. So I think that's kind of turning the chord.
Yeah, it's made me, I think, a better fan too, because things that I would just kind of be dismissive of in the past, I'll give a chance now. It's like when somebody announces a crossover between, this is not a real crossover, but it's like, oh, we're gonna do a Fantastic Four and Scrooge McDuck crossover. Normally I'd be like rolling my eyes, but now I think, well, you know what? I'm the guy who wrote the Flintstones, so maybe someone will do a good job with this. It's made me more open to trying things that normally I would just kind of like dismiss without really giving it a chance. And I hope that's what it's done for other people too.
I think so, and that's kind of in a reason like this podcast exists too. It's about trying to push forward comics that people don't normally go to, not kind of getting them out of just that superhero realm and letting them know there's tons of other things, nonfiction, a lot of different ways to approach the medium. Now that you've been in it for a few years, do you find yourself, are there any current comics or graphic novels that you've grown to appreciate and read on a regular basis?
Yeah. Oh man, I've been reading the Ed Piskor's X-Men Grand Design comic.
Oh yeah, that was amazing.
It was just fantastic. I think it's kind of the similar thing. What I did with the Bible. It's like here, let's get you caught up on what's happened for the last 2,000 years, and yeah, it's really great. And I also really enjoy the obviously everyone on the planet does, like Tom King's Batman has been great, and yeah, one of my favorite graphic novels in recent years, and I'm sure I don't know if everyone's read this, but it's not like a real obscure one. Daniel Clow's Patience, which I just thought was brilliant, like Nobel Prize Literature brilliant. So yeah, there's a lot out there. It's I've been reading a lot more comics than I used to, just because I'm in the medium now, and I'm continually surprised at how much really good work there is in it.
Does the work of someone like a Robert Crumb, he also obviously has a lot of books that are centered on the Bible, like Genesis, or were those books that you look to for your work at all, or that you've had the opportunity to read?
Yeah, I read the Robert Crumb Genesis. In a lot of ways, I feel like he did the opposite of what I did in writing the book about the Bible.
Yeah,
that he is taking every single chapter and magnifying into this sort of like visual epic.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm taking like whole books, and condensing them down to like a page or two.
I gotta ask, was it your idea, or God's disappointed in You and Apocrypha Now, to design them as actual, like, make them look like a Bible?
They kind of came out of a discussion between myself and Shannon Wheeler, who did the cartoons, and Chris Staros, who was the publisher of Top Shelf, who published them. We came up with about 10 different titles for the book, but we decided the only one we really liked was God is Disappointed in You, because it sort of summarizes the entire Bible in one line. But then if we go with that title, how do we let people know what this book is, that it's actually a retelling of the Bible? And so the next logical solution was, well, what if we just designed the book to look like a Bible with the title God is Disappointed in You? And then so the title kind of beget the design idea.
Interesting. I think you'll find this funny in the sense of, I was actually reading it at work, and during like a break, and there was a people next to me like having a conversation, and they were having some choice language, and they looked over and they saw me reading, and I think they thought I was reading the Bible, and they began to apologize for their language, and I just went with it, but I thought it was pretty humorous if they just only knew what I was actually reading.
Yeah, I will say the thing I like about the book is that, like selling it at a con, is that you see a lot of people do double takes as they walk by. Because out of the corner of their eye, they just think it's like a Bible, and then like they notice the title, and then they had to do a quick double take, and they usually get them to come back and read it.
Yeah,
it's a real gratifying thing to have happen.
I could imagine. Yeah, I was taken back by it myself when I first picked it up. I'm like, am I getting the right? Yeah. I'm like, all right, well that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people this book is not for, and who will not like this book. But I feel like everyone who walks by it feels the need to at least pick it up and open it to a page and give it a chance.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it. I come from my family, very religious, and they thought it was humorous as well. So at least you got that going.
Yeah, I have to say that I think Christians have really embraced the book in a way I didn't think would really happen. But I think it's because they see I'm not trying to make fun of the Bible or denigrate believers of the Bible in any way. I'm just trying to understand why the people who wrote it the way they did. Yeah. And I think that they appreciate that because it's something they don't get from other Christian literature. It's like a lot of times when you read books about the Bible that are written by people who believe in the Bible, you feel like you're visiting a used car lot. It's always sell, get them to sign on the line that is dotted. And so it's refreshing for people, even people who do believe in the Bible, to talk about it in a framework where somebody's not trying to close the deal.
Yeah, and I think it's too approaching some of those stories that you realize are actually in the Bible that you don't, like you mentioned in the opening of the book, that people don't tend to talk about, and you realize, wow, that actually happened in the Bible, and if they ever made a movie out of the Bible, it'd probably be rated like XXX or something like that, just with everything that actually went in.
It would not be for kids. In fact, I had one lady like asked me at a signing. She's like, "Oh, my would this book be okay for kids?" And I said, "Well, it is the Bible, so no." Because there's some pretty graphic, medieval stuff that happens in there. I mean, people say, I'm going to get biblical on you for a reason. There's a reason why that metaphor works.
Very true. Very true. But yeah, well, those are pretty much all the questions that I had. I did, again, want to thank you for taking the time. And as I mentioned, we talked about a lot of your material that is out right now. If people wanted to follow you or learn more about your work, what would be the best way to do that?
Best way is probably to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Manruss, Manruss. And then, just keep an eye out for titles I'm working on. Judge Dredd comes out on May 30th, issue number 1. And they're in Snagglepuss number 4 is in stores now.
Nice. Is your Judge Dredd, is that a miniseries, or is that going to be an ongoing, or is that still undecided?
It's a miniseries. It's going to be 4 issues long.
Nice. Very nice. Yeah, so definitely check that out, and as we talked about some of the other material today. So thank you so much. Well, that was my interview with Mark Russell, and I want to thank him again for taking time out to come visit my silly podcast. I enjoyed speaking with him a great deal, and I hope you enjoyed listening. If you did like this interview and you want to listen to more Comic Come to Yours, there's a lot coming up that I'm really excited about. I'm going to be continuing the conversation regarding Harrow County as Matt from Simplistic Reviews returns as we talk about Volume 2. Also upcoming, I'll be talking with another Matt, my fellow cinema geek, Matt Fridley Sent, about the Silver Surfer series done by Dan Slott and Mike Allred. Really excited about that conversation. It's a great series, so there's a lot to dive into there. And of course, this is coming out the same week as Action Comics 1000, and I'll be certainly covering that in the upcoming Weekly Recommends podcast, along with a host of other podcasts coming up that I'm really excited about and should be able to announce shortly. Anyways, thanks all for listening, and always remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thanks for listening.